Now I'd like to introduce David Wertime, Senior Editor, Foreign Policy Magazine, and perhaps for those of us in the China biz, more important, co-founder and editor of Tea Leaf Nation. And David will be talking about how information moves in Chinese cyberspace. David.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be here in the beautiful Bay Area today. As Dr. Gold said, I, about 4 years ago, founded a website, or helped found a website called Tea Leaf Nation, which has since been acquired by my current employer. And that website focuses and focused on Chinese social media and the Chinese internet. So I'd like to talk just a bit about what I've learned during my approximately 4 years watching this space. First, let me just start with a very quick primer so you know some of the basic vocabulary. Up top is the current major social network in China today. It's called WeChat, or Weixin in Chinese. It's basically a mobile-only platform, and it allows you to communicate within friend circles the way that you might sort of on Facebook. Discussions are restricted to your friend circles. And it's also a platform not only for communication, but for commerce. There are ways to buy and sell, to order taxis, to send money. It has 549 million monthly active users. That's active users, unbelievably. And it was released January 2011. And WeChat has essentially, and WeChat is owned, I might add, by a private and operated by a private company called Tencent. WeChat has essentially replaced Weibo, which I know you've heard that word a couple times before. Weibo is something like Twitter in China. Weibo allows you to communicate in short posts with anybody who happens to be reading your post. And so it's basically a one-to-many platform where you can write something that is potentially viewable by everybody else on the platform, which is not the case on WeChat. Weibo was founded August 2009, really had its heyday, as I will discuss, in 2010, 2011. And it's a platform for, and this is actually from its, I think it's 10K, self-expression and social interaction. That's the words of the company, Sina, that operates Weibo, and I think is a bit more liberally minded. Weibo has 175 million monthly active users. Still massive, still more than 10% of the Chinese population, but as you'll see, and as you see, not quite as many as WeChat. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, how Chinese social media has served a number of very important roles in the last few years. It, I think, has been one of the closest things that China has to a platform for free speech and debate on the issues of the day. And I'm speaking in kind of the present perfect, because that is less and less true as I say this. But it has been, and continues to be arguably, the freest platform for free speech and debate in the country, a driver of major national conversations, or conversations that can become national. And it's also a window into the country for people, non-Chinese, people like me, who have spent time in the country but might be working abroad, or might not have time to interview tens of thousands of people on the street to gauge internal sentiment. It has been one of the most powerful ways to understand what's going on in China and what people there really think. That has been true. It's been less true over the last couple years, but it could become very true again. So let me introduce you briefly to a couple of the characters in Chinese cyberspace. One I thought you might want to meet is the Wu Mao. And Wu Mao literally means 50 cents, the equivalent of 50 Chinese cents. And that's the number that allegedly, that's the amount of money that the government allegedly pays to pro-government posters, people who go online and say things that the government would want them to say. And a description of them, which is available online, depicts them as, quote, fiercely ignorant, inserting themselves in everything. They consider themselves spokesmen for the country. Wumao has become shorthand for somebody who reflexively supports the government or levels ad hominem attacks on those who do not. So this is a major character in Chinese cyberspace. Their tactics include appeals to nationalism, appeals to communal piety, and again, ad hominem attacks on those who espouse different ideas. Let me just move all the way over to the other end of the spectrum and introduce you to the public intellectual. This is not my drawing. This is a fair use internet grab. And this is a depiction of, in Chinese, it's called gongzhi. It means public intellectual. And some descriptions of public intellectual, which you can also find online, are that everyone knows he only cries for American imperialists. It's actually in the language here. And some of the other language here asks, what of the deaths of innocents in Iran and Iraq? That has nothing to do with me, i.e., they're accused of reflexive support for American interests. And those American interests, of course, are highly suspect in some quarters in China. So this obviously is used as a pejorative. And part of what drives the depiction of these so-called public intellectuals and the battles that they may have online with Wumao, or those who are called Wumao, Chinese nationalists, paid government posters in some cases, are over questions like how Western is it to call for legal rights, taxpayer rights, constitutionalism. As Dr. Gold was discussing, the concepts of, or as Mary Kay was discussing, the concept of a citizen as opposed to a subject. Human rights. The views that so-called public intellectuals espouse are minority views within China, to be certain, but they are an influential minority, in many cases with elite educations. Many of the ideas that they espouse are in some cases common sense and resonate widely even among those who are not public intellectuals. Again, this concept of having rights as a taxpayer or being a citizen of your own country. With that, let me just move into a few, I guess, inelegantly named case studies. Basically, examples of major discussions that have happened online in recent years. And what I want to do really is give you a sense of the power of the Chinese social web, the ways in which the government has tried to tamp down that power while still harnessing the many benefits to an economy that an internet and to a society that the internet can bring. And also just to depict the fact that the Chinese social web is very much a contested space. So one very, very seminal event when it comes to the power of the Chinese internet and the understanding of that is a train crash in coastal city of Wenzhou. China's high-speed rail system, which now boasts over 70 lines crisscrossing the country, has been a major multi-billion-dollar project for the Chinese government. But corruption, in particular in the early days, infected the process of the build-out of this rail line and the Ministry of Railways. And in July of 2011, there was a crash in the city of Wenzhou between two trains when a signal failed, and over 40 people died. And these defects were in many cases a result of the kind of cutting of corners that happens when money's being siphoned from public coffers. Authorities in Wenzhou actually tried to bury the derailed cars, but not before reporters and witnesses could spread images of this crash via Weibo, via the Weibo platform, remembering that WeChat wasn't really dominant then. And this information kept leaking into the public sphere, and it meant that government prohibitions on directives to restrict coverage, trying to prevent state media from going to the site of the accident and report on it, were essentially ignored. And so the proverbial cat got out of the proverbial bag very quickly on this one. And the Chinese government does delete a substantial minority of social media posts. And it obviously seeks to issue directives to both state and non-state media outlets telling them what they can and can't report on. But the lesson of Wenzhou, among others, is that Chinese cyberspace would not submit easily to censorship. It's not enough because authorities simply could not keep up with the profusion of posts and information that these hundreds of millions of internet users were sharing. Here's another case study. The ruined career of Yang Dacai, a former provincial safety chief. He was jailed in September 2013 for 14 years for corruption. In August 2012, he was discovered smiling at the scene of a nasty accident. Remember, he was the provincial safety chief, so not something you should do when you're the safety chief. And this image was discovered online. Chinese internet users quickly decided that they did not like this man, and so they commenced a sort of crowdsourced investigation into Yang Dacai. And they found images of him scattered across the internet showing him wearing very expensive watches, the cumulative, manufactured suggested retail price of which no honest public official could afford. And so that was really the end of him. And the takeaway here is that, well, first of all, as we've all learned perhaps the hard way, the internet is an archive, and nothing about you goes away, and it can also be powerfully leveraged by crowds. And so Chinese officials, really ever since, have been rightly terrified of being spotted with too many luxury belts or handbags or timepieces. And so this remains true and sort of casts a shadow, I think. Let me move on to August 2013, which is really when things began to turn. So I've given you two examples of the power of Chinese social media. Those images of the Wenzhou train crash, those images of Yang Dacai, both spread primarily via the Weibo platform. But in August 2013, the internet czar of China, whose name is Lu Wei, had a sit-down with a number of so-called big Vs. And a V is what shows up next to your name when your account's verified. That's true on Twitter, too. And it tends to be sort of more prominent users or folks in media, people who have a bit of a megaphone into the public sphere. Starting around this time, Lu Wei sat down with a number of the big Vs and explained that they needed to be more responsible. They needed to stop being gongzhis. They needed to stop being public intellectuals, sharing liberal ideas. This was something that was frightening to the Communist Party. These are people who had followers in aggregate, in some cases, that rivaled in their size the membership of the Communist Party. And these folks, in many cases, had the ability to publish their thoughts instantly. The picture you see here is of one such big V. His name is Charles Xue. He was a venture capitalist with liberal ideas. He was arrested, I believe, in September 2013 for soliciting a prostitute. And he was paraded before state media in a prison suit, declared his guilt before trial. He may have been guilty of that, but it was widely understood that he was not really arrested for that crime. And this crackdown that began in August 2013, the Big V crackdown, was the first of several waves of crackdowns that have involved the shuttering of accounts, the arrest, detention, questioning of many Big Vs, many online opinion leaders. And so the takeaway here was that the Chinese government had an important insight. And I don't mean insight in this case in a nice way. The Chinese government realized that online public opinion is powered by a relatively small group of individuals, or in some cases anyway, it is. And that small group of influential people can themselves be influenced by fear. The fear of arrest, the fear of prosecution, the fear of public humiliation. If you can put that fear into them, you can help to control public opinion. You can help to stamp down that unpredictable element. Also, the Chinese government realized, okay, we can't just censor, we've also got to intimidate the major people, the major online opinion leaders. And the Chinese government has to fill the void with something. Staid state media, press release types of reporting, which dominated in particular before the commercialization of Chinese media in the mid-90s, is not enough to fulfill demand in the age of social media, and it's not going to resonate in the age of social media. You've got to pep things up. You've got to spice things up. So the Chinese government over the last couple years in particular has gotten better at providing social media friendly pablum in many cases. And what you have as a result is an internet that is calm and peppy on the surface. This is a cartoon, clearly approved from the top. This is a cartoon of current Chinese President Xi Jinping. He famously, in late 2013, ordered his own dumplings at a Beijing dumplings shop, which is very, well, actually it was impressive because that's not something that a Chinese president had been seen doing before. And this cartoon, the man up top says, "Chairman," and he says, "Everybody sit. I am just here to eat." It's not really funny, but I mean, that's the cartoon. And so the takeaway here again is that censorship isn't sufficient. The party, the Communist Party, has to flood the digital space with its own messages to kind of crowd out the other stuff that might get people's attention. And of course, the corollary of this is that over the last couple years, Chinese social media has, to a substantial extent, ceased to be a channel for information discovery and breaking news. Think back to Wenzhou, those images of those buried trains being spread among the internet millions. Instead, it's in many cases a place where the party speaks louder than anybody else, which resembles old mainstream media. However, social media still has a lot of latent power. Here's an example. In February 2015, a former, an anchor for China Central Television, or a reporter for China Central Television, which is state-owned, Chai Jing, put out an Al Gore-style documentary, kind of like An Inconvenient Truth. This was called Under the Dome. And it came out with what appeared to be the blessing of high Chinese authorities, and it got social media help, actually, from state outlets. And this became instant national water cooler conversation around China. It was viewed over 100 million times on social media streaming sites, and it was very well done. After a few days of Chai Jing's environmental documentary dominating Chinese conversation, the government censored it, which appeared to be an about-face, which appeared to reflect a misestimation of what was going to sort of go viral and be powerful in Chinese cyberspace. So this remains an X factor. Very much like in the United States, you never really know what's going to be popular. And that doubt is, I think, frightening to party authorities. Just to give you one more example of a recent social media event, if you can call it that. There was a Yangtze River cruise which called the Oriental Star, which sank or capsized, which capsized in June 2015. It killed over 400 people, many of them who were seniors. This was a horrific tragedy. And from a media analysis perspective, it was a powerful case study because there was initially huge reaction online. It was a huge topic. And some of that initial reaction questioned, who is this company that operates this liner? Were proper safety measures taken? Why did the captain manage to escape and ignore or be late to respond to warnings about an incoming typhoon? The government actually ultimately reacted in a number of ways. First, it flooded, and that's a bad metaphor, but actually an apt one here. It flooded Chinese social media feeds with its own coverage. Positive stories about the national unity and resilience in the face of this disaster, as central government sent diving teams came and tried their best, I'm sure, to rescue whoever was left. And the government silenced families questioning the official narrative. Not one of these families, to my knowledge, said anything on social media, which clearly reflects the lessons from Wenzhou, right? And what really happened in the case of this disaster is from the silence of the families to the silence of these big Vs, you see that Xi Jinping, the current president, passed his first major test on social media. This could have been Wenzhou 2.0, but it was not, because the Chinese government has gotten a lot better at managing social media and managing the tides of public opinion. So just to recap a little bit, since we're talking about civil society, what about the web scares the party? Now notice, I don't have a what about the web excites the party. That doesn't mean there isn't a long list, right? They see it as an engine for innovation, for wealth, for commerce. But there are certain aspects of the internet inherent to its structure that I believe scares the Communist Party. So news and information can leak before it has been vetted by propaganda authorities and then spread wildly. That's the lesson of Wenzhou. Online anti-government anger is real and can ruin careers. I should have added, it's not very hard to find people criticizing the government on Chinese social media even now. I don't think they're too concerned when somebody says something very general. But what does worry them is when you have people uncovering news or uncovering scandals and sharing that in a way that becomes a national conversation. So that anger is real and it can ruin careers. Big Vs can publish instantly to huge groups of followers that can exceed the size of the Communist Party. And the web has a way of cohering and focusing public opinion around certain events or certain particularly resonant pieces of news or information. That's what Under the Dome did. Even in the face of a tragedy like the Yangtze River disaster, where the government did manage online opinion successfully, that still had the ability to bring everybody back to their computers. They were on Weibo as well as WeChat talking about this. And those moments of crystallization and coherence have the ability to knit together far-flung populations within China. Again, people who don't know one another, but share a common set of complaints or questions. It allows them to connect, and that ability to unify instantly is powerful and thus frightening. And it also signals to those with minority opinions that they're not alone. So it's not just that you had a big V going online onto Weibo and saying something liberal. It's that everybody who read it knew that, okay, that is an opinion that somebody prominent within China holds. And even if they themselves didn't say anything, they were a lurker online, they now knew that they perhaps were not alone in sharing whatever opinion or in holding whatever opinion they did about a particular issue. So those are some of the things. And what it means is that the internet remains, I guess I would call it, a silent battleground. The battleground language isn't mine. That's been used by some state mouthpieces. You heard earlier that there had been the arrest and detention of over 150 rights lawyers and activists in July. One of the main crimes, or so-called crimes, that was listed in what was essentially a state media set of accusations against them was media hype, using the media to bring cases from inside the courtroom out into the public sphere to get people riled up. This is a picture of Wang Yu, one of the arrested. And so, although the surface of Chinese social media these days is calm and ruddy, and what you generally see is pictures of food, dogs, cats, and celebrities, it's worth noting that the media apparatus in China remains immensely complex, sometimes disobedient, and this online space is fiercely contested. What the government wants, again, is an internet where, to quote their czar, Lu Wei, differences are shelved. They want it to be an engine of commerce where nobody really says anything too controversial. But many of the things inherent to the structure of the internet that scare authorities remain. Thanks so much.